For quite some time, Vladimir Putin has been certain that Russia would emerge victorious in the Ukraine war. The plan was for a swift victory, but that's not how it unfolded. Russia's goal was to wear down Ukraine, but it has failed to do so. At this point, a victory for Putin would look like persuading Ukraine to hand over territory in Donbas to Russia. This is a far cry from what Putin originally intended. However, if Finland has any influence, the Russian president won't even achieve that much. With a pointed message, Finland has dealt Putin a double blow, making it clear to the Russian leader that his authority will never receive official recognition. While this has rattled the Kremlin, Putin might find a lifeline in US President Donald Trump. The BBC reported on October 18th about various statements from Finnish President Alexander Stubb during an interview on BBC Radio 4's Today program. Stubb stated unequivocally that Finland will never, at any point in the future, recognize Crimea as Russian territory.
Putin annexed the peninsula in 2014, and it has remained under Russian occupation for more than 10 years. To Stubb, this fact is irrelevant. According to the Centre for European Reform, or CER, Finland has been progressively reducing its reliance on Russia as a trading partner ever since the annexation of Crimea. The CER presents a compelling chart that reveals in 2012, roughly 18% of Finland's imports originated from Russia. By 2015, just 1 year after Crimea's annexation, that figure had fallen to around 11%.
And while imports did climb back to 14% in the subsequent years, they plummeted to a new low of 8% in 2022, the same year Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. For over a decade, Finland has been signaling its seriousness to Russia through these consistent trade reductions. Stubb has now verbally confirmed what Finland's actions have long suggested. But on October 17th, Crimea wasn't the only thing on his agenda. Beyond stating that Finland would never acknowledge the Russian occupation of the peninsula, Stubb also declared that this stance applies to any territory Russia attempts to claim through its invasion of Ukraine. He specifically brought up the Luhansk and Donetsk regions within Donbas. The BBC reports that Russia currently holds about 70% of Donetsk and nearly all of Luhansk. However, according to Finland's president, an invasion does not grant ownership. In a clear message aimed at Putin, Stubb asserted, "The only ones who can decide on the land issue are the Ukrainians themselves." What Stubb is communicating is that this land is not Russia's for the taking, regardless of how desperately Putin might wish to claim it is. The Russian leader is frantically trying to seize as much of the Donbas as he can. In an August 19th article, Al Jazeera outlined some of the motivations, highlighting the strategic, economic and symbolic advantages for the Kremlin. On the economic front, the outlet cites the Center for Strategic and International Studies' Mark F. Kansian, who says, "The Donbas was highly industrialized in the mid-20th century, though it became something of a rust belt after the Cold War." Kansian also mentions that the area's farmland is some of the best in the world, so Putin could be aiming to revive the industrial Donbas of the Soviet period while also capitalizing on its status as a breadbasket for much of Europe. But another economic driver is at play here: minerals. Donbas holds significant reserves of many valuable metals and minerals that Putin is eager to exploit. Right now, Al Jazeera reports, Russia already controls around 40% of Ukraine's metal resources. Donetsk also contains the Shevchenko field of lithium ores, one of Ukraine's most substantial lithium deposits. The Economic Times also points out that Donbas has approximately 56% of Ukraine's hard coal reserves, valued at an estimated $12 trillion. This is in addition to the $12.5 trillion in mineral and gas assets that Russian occupiers currently control in Ukraine. A vast fortune is at stake in Donbas, and Putin views this figurative gold mine as an ideal way to stabilize Russia's economy after the war. From a strategic perspective, Al Jazeera explains, the Russian-occupied port in Mariupol provides year-round entry into the Black Sea. This access, combined with the passage already secured through the annexed Crimean Peninsula, would effectively give Russia control over the Black Sea if it could base more of its navy there. Yet, Al Jazeera suggests the symbolic significance of Donbass is perhaps even more crucial to Putin. The region has a large population of native Russian speakers. In Donetsk alone, nearly 75% of residents speak Russian at home, and in Luhansk, the figure is 68.8%. This is a legacy of Russian migration to Donbass during the Soviet period, a fact Putin exploits as supposed proof that the region rightfully belongs to Russia. Eric Heron, a political scientist with West Virginia University, explains to Al Jazeera, Russia has made many unsubstantiated claims about the treatment of Russian speakers there by the Ukrainian government. Donbass is symbolically central to Russia's story about why the war is happening. This symbolism is a powerful motivator. Should Ukraine relinquish Donbass to Russia, Putin could present it as validation for his invasion justifications. For Ukraine, the consequence would be a much longer, more immediate border with Russia. In other words, Putin might settle for Donbass for now, but after fortifying his presence there, the remainder of Ukraine would once again be in his sights. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has consistently said he will not surrender Donbass in a deal for peace. Now, Stubb has entered the conversation. Finland's president has, in just a few sentences, informed Putin that any annexation of Donbass not made solely by Ukraine will be deemed illegitimate by Finland. It is a move that will never be accepted, which means Putin cannot leverage control over the region to curry favor with Finland or, most likely, the rest of Western Europe. This was the first of Stubb's slaps to Putin's face. As the Russian leader was figuratively reeling, Stubb dealt a second blow. Ukraine needs to become a member of the European Union, or EU, and, ideally, NATO. I want to make sure that Ukraine, when this war is over, retains its independence, retains its sovereignty. In other words, becomes an EU member state and hopefully a NATO member, and also maintains its territorial integrity, Euromaidan Press quotes Stubb as saying, "That is what we are all fighting for right now." Putin may not be significantly affected by Ukraine joining the EU, at least according to his own statements. As per DW, Russia AS leader has tried to claim he never had an issue with Ukraine AS EU membership. The outlet notes Russia has never formally opposed Ukraine's desire to join the EU. Putin reiterated this during a September visit to China, stating, "As for Ukraine's membership of the EU, we have never objected to this," before specifying, "As for NATO, this is another issue." So, Russia's public position seems to be yes to the EU, but no to NATO. Stubb is advocating for both for Ukraine, and Putin's remarks about EU membership could be insincere. It is crucial to recall the objective of Russia's supposed special military operation. Putin's fundamental belief is that Ukraine should not exist as an independent state. It's possible Putin never formally protested Ukraine's EU ambitions because he anticipated the nation would be under Russian control long before it became a relevant issue. But Ukraine is not under Russian control. Now, it appears Putin is attempting to use the issue of EU membership as leverage to secure what he currently wants: Donbass. Going back to Stubb's statements, two questions arise. Will Ukraine be able to join the EU? And will it one day join NATO? Answering the EU question is much simpler, as Ukraine has already applied and is in the process of negotiating its membership. The EU approved the start of accession talks in December 2023. And those talks officially began about 6 months later. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was also swift to emphasize the EU's eagerness to bring Ukraine into the fold. Europe is in the eyes of all Ukrainians who fight for a better future. And together, we can win this fight. Together, we can complete our union. Together, we can bring Ukraine in our common European home. This is the dream of Ukraine's heroes and Ukraine's martyrs. And it is our dream too. Together, we are Europe. Von der Leyen has said of Ukraine's desired EU membership. In February, von der Leyen further stated that Ukraine is poised to become an EU member before the end of the decade. I really appreciate the political will that is there. I would even say Ukraine's merit-based process. If they continue at that speed, and at that quality, perhaps they could be earlier than 2030, the European Commission president claimed. Wait a minute. 2030? That seems like a very distant target, which might make one question the EU's sincerity. However, those doubts fade when considering the highly bureaucratic nature of the EU. A 6-year timeline from application to the end of 2029 is, in fact, an accelerated process. As the Pew Research Center notes, the typical duration from application to full membership is around 9 years, putting Ukraine on a path 3 years faster than average. While not a certainty, Ukraine's membership in the EU appears highly probable. However, the nation's potential NATO membership, which Stubb and Finland endorse, is a much less settled matter. Putin has voiced his opposition to this on numerous occasions. And he is not alone. On August 18th, ahead of a meeting with Zelensky at the White House, Trump claimed that Ukraine's president could end the war, if he wants to. But, he stipulated, any peace agreement would include no going into NATO by Ukraine. This appears to be Trump signaling that Putin has drawn a red line regarding Ukraine's NATO membership. For Ukraine, these statements from Trump are a significant hurdle. The U.S., after all, is undeniably the leading force within NATO, owing to its massive military spending, its relationships with other members, and the 5,225 nuclear weapons in its arsenal, as reported by the Arms Control Association. In a March article for the Cato Institute, Doug Bandow pointed out that a series of U.S. presidents have said no to Ukraine's NATO bid. Trump's latest refusal is just the most recent, as both Joe Biden and Barack Obama also declined to entertain the idea. Interestingly, Bandow notes that former President George W. Bush actually advocated for Ukraine's membership, but he suggests Bush's backing might have been the very thing that sparked the current crisis. The transatlantic alliance's resulting promise to include Kiev, made at Bush's behest at the 2008 Bucharest NATO summit, was an essential factor in Moscow's decision for war nearly 14 years later, Bandow writes. The reason Ukraine desires NATO membership is obvious. It sees membership as a deterrent against any future aggression from Putin. If Ukraine were to gain membership while the war is ongoing, Putin would face a new dilemma. A continued attack would invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, effectively starting a war with all 32 NATO members plus Ukraine. This reality clarifies the U.S.'s reluctance. The situation becomes more complex when considering the post-war scenario. If Ukraine were granted NATO membership after the conflict, and this holds true even for a Ukraine that has ceded Donbass, Putin would be enraged. Would he be angry enough to ignite another war, knowing it would mean a direct conflict with NATO? No one can say for sure. And therein lies the issue. But for Stubb, whose own country joined NATO only after Putin's invasion, the solution to Ukraine's NATO dilemma is straightforward. By declaring that Ukraine will hopefully join NATO, Stubb lands his second Finnish slap right on Putin's face. He is signaling to Russia that Finland, for one, would back Ukraine's entry into the Collective Defense Alliance, perhaps because Stubb thinks Finland could be Putin's next target. This is a sentiment held by many of his fellow citizens, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation noted on October 18th. The Finnish people cite their nation's geography and its history with Russia as reasons they believe Putin will set his sights on them next. That history reveals some notable parallels with Ukraine, especially the fact that Finland ceded 10% of its land to Russia in a peace treaty following the Winter War, which Russia initiated in 1939. Finland understands the experience of losing territory to Russia. Stubb's remarks imply that his nation will not stand by and let Ukraine suffer a similar fate, and that Finland will endorse EU and NATO membership to safeguard Ukraine's sovereignty. The double slap has landed, leaving the Kremlin appropriately rattled. But there is a major caveat. As significant as this is, Finland's voice is relatively small in the broader global context. Stubb himself acknowledges this, pointing out that Trump is the sole Western leader with the genuine clout to get Putin to negotiate. In his Radio 4 interview, Stubb mentioned he had told Trump that Putin couldn't be trusted during one of their golf games. What we need is not so much the power of the carrot to convince Russia to the negotiating table, It's more of the stick that will bring them, Stubb explained. So you have to force Russia to come to the negotiating table for peace, and that's the deal President Trump is trying to make. Essentially, Trump cannot entice Putin to make peace by giving in to his demands. Rather, pressure is what will be effective, and Trump is uniquely positioned to apply the kind of pressure required to make Putin concede. This brings up a clear question. Will Trump help to create that pressure? It could happen. At the time this video was made, Trump and Putin were scheduled to meet in Hungary for a peace discussion. This has generated some interesting queries, such as whether it's even secure for Putin to travel over the airspace of several European nations. At the very least, Hungary is currently withdrawing from the International Criminal Court, or ICC, so it is not obligated to act on the arrest warrant the ICC issued for Putin in March 2023. In that regard, Putin will be secure. Still, his discussion with Trump could unfold in various ways. Exiled Russian oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky is one person who believes Putin is prepared to negotiate. I have the impression that Putin has sent Trump a signal that he is ready for a deal, Khodorkovsky remarked. He then admitted, however, that he is no longer certain he knows what Putin's objectives are, and that he has never had any idea about Trump's actual aims. Trump might have already hinted at the potential result. On October 19th, The Independent covered remarks he made to a Fox News anchor, which imply he anticipates Ukraine will have to give up some territory. Speaking about Putin, Trump said, "Well, he's going to take something. I mean, they fought and he has a lot of property. I mean, he's won certain property." That statement casts a significant pall over Stubb's defiant gesture. Finland's commitment to protecting Ukraine's sovereignty might be outweighed by Trump's belief that the war can be concluded if Ukraine surrenders some land. This is not the stick that Stubb mentioned. On the contrary, it would be a very tempting carrot. For his part, Zelensky maintains that the U.S. and the West must intensify the pressure. Also on October 19th, Ukraine's president called on Trump to take a harder line and even suggested he'd be open to attending the Hungary summit. Drawing a parallel between Ukraine and the Israel-Gaza situation, Zelensky labeled Putin a terrorist. Putin is something similar but more strong than Hamas, Zelensky stated, highlighting that Russia possesses the world's second-largest army. And that's why more pressure is necessary to make Putin cease his actions, Zelensky concluded. Exactly as Stubb argues, the stick will be more effective than the carrot. Which approach will Trump take? We should know after the meeting in Hungary. For the time being, Finland's double slap against Putin shows the country's profound support for Ukraine, to the point that it wants to see Ukraine achieve everything, including full NATO membership. And Finland might soon be joined by another influential NATO member in that stance. Russia is engaged in something ominous over Germany. We expose this shadow war in our next video, so be sure to watch it for more details. And if you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe to Warzone Party for more current analysis of the latest events in the Ukraine war.